I'm going to be covering here in this next mini lecture adaptation and adaptationism. According to adaptationism, evolutionary biologists are in the business of constructing adaptive stories about why organisms are the way they are. Dennett is vitriolic whenever adaptationism is questioned because he perceives that to be an opening for a skyhook. He suspects it's a skyhook. The bad guys in Dennett's book in these three chapters, 9, 10, and 11, the bad guys are those intellectual reactionaries who have convinced others that Darwinism can be safely bottled up within evolutionary biology. Dennett says, Darwinism can expand beyond the bounds of evolutionary biology and is in fact a universal asset, as he puts it in chapter 3. Dennett thinks that he has found a common anti-Darwinism sin that binds the men spoken of in these chapters together. In one way or another, he argues, they all invoke a skyhook or a miraculous force or process that gets snuck via the back door to explain some aspect of design in the world, be it a ball plan, a universal grammar, or even a moral code, as we find out in chapter 11. Among these secular thinkers, they all try, according to Dennett, to limit the all-embracing character or logic of Darwinism, but to no avail. Among pre-Darwinian naturalists, God served as an unusually conspicuous skyhook. But bring on the acid. Darwinism teaches us that skyhooks are mythical. Full stop. His main targets in these chapters are the Harvard biologists Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, of which I'm going to be writing my dissertation on Stephen Jay Gould, FYI. You can read that later. Gould and Lewontin's warning to evolutionary biology was very simply spoken. Organisms may sport spandrels. They may sport spandrels. Spandrels, the terminology of spandrels has a very interesting etymology. In Italian temples, I should say Italian cathedrals, of course, you have these mosaics on the ceilings and on the walls, where one dome comes together to meet another dome. There's what is referred to as a spandrel there. The spandrel is architecturally necessitated by just putting the dome together, but it's not functional. But these spandrels, these places that people paint mosaics on in these Italian cathedrals, they function as a spandrel because they're not necessary, yet they're often beautifully complex, as well as, descriptive, or I should say expressive and so forth. They're spandrels, they're architectural spandrels. Gould and Lewontin suggest strongly that most of evolution is nothing but a bunch of spandrels, things that happen as a consequence of structural necessity. Structural necessity. Gould and Lewontin's warning was obvious. Some traits have no adaptive tail to tell, but reflect structural constraints imposed by an organism's development instead. Gould expands and defends Darwin's theory and posits that Darwinism is a two-part series of contingency and conventional causality, that is, chance and necessity. Contingency rules the day, but because there are infinite galaxies with which for complexity to occur, our galaxy has stumbled upon it in a nonchalant way. Contingency, Gould notes, is the tendency for complex systems with substantial stochastic fluctuating components to be unpredictable in principle from a full knowledge of their prior conditions or antecedent conditions, but fully explicable after its actualization. Gould writes, In a major revision to Darwinian logic, chance has been elevated from its traditional and restricted role as a generator of raw material only to a more active part of evolutionary change, making it an important evolutionary agent of change in both the qualitative and quantitative senses. Chance has been elevated into a very important position in Stephen Jay Gould's theory of evolution. And I'm going to explicate a few of these quirkinesses now. Consider the quirky example of the blind spot of the eye. We all have them. We all have blind spots. Why do we have blind spots? Wouldn't an ingenious creator create a human being that doesn't have a blind spot? If you think about it, it's a penetrating critique. The blind spot represents the point where the optic nerve inside our eye sort of invaginates, that is, moves inward just a second, to the retina in order to directly reach the brain. Our blind spot is maladaptive, and it is the legacy of our evolutionary past. It was not designed by God, nor do I even think it was designed by adaptationism. Not at all. At some point early in evolutionary history, the blind spot developed because light-sensitive tissue folded up in such a way, our proto-eye, the eye spots that we see in lower divisional mammals. They're not eyes, but they're eye spots. They're light-sensing organs. They can sense light. They can turn away from it, and then they can turn toward it, but they don't sense anything. Nevertheless, at some point in early vertebrate evolution, light-sensitive tissue invaginated in such a way that our eye spot was left with its neural wiring on the inside. Once evolution veered off in this direction, a blind spot was a structural inevitability. The blind spot, then, is another singularity of the type mentioned at the beginning of my first lecture with regard to Christian de Duve. One makes up adapted just so stories about this resulting blind spot at their own peril. And we see manifold examples of that over Christian history, trying to set adaptive answers to spandrels that have no adaptive meaning whatsoever. It just is what it is, period. Although many biologists suspect that Gould and Lewontin overstate their warning, most would, I think, agree with John Maynard Smith's contention that their paper was on the whole welcome in the contemporary context. Unfortunately, however, such moderate positions do not come natural to Dennett. Although he pays lip service to the notion that any adaptive system suffers from under-designed features, Dennett is irate about Gould and Lewontin and their nefarious spandrels. The strange thing is, it's not really obvious why. Why, after all, should a man hoping to export Darwinism from biology be so obsessed with defending the intricacies or the minutiae of adaptive storytelling within biology itself? I would not think the legitimacy of say, cultural evolutionism, cultural Darwinism that is, hangs critically on whether selection is very important or direly important. One of the two, it matters not. Cultural Darwinism could be right or wrong in either case, but Dennett seems convinced that his position is at stake in this distinction. Apparently, my friends, Dennett sees red whenever adaptationism is questioned because he suspects a plot to sneak in a skyhook. In other words, if you don't like adaptationism, what do you think explains all this biological design? Unfortunately, Dennett's skyhook phobia gets the best of him, I do contend, undermining any hope of a balanced view of the powers and perils of adaptationism. Dennett never once mentions a prominent example of something that might belie his thesis of cranes. For example, 1/3 of his book examines challenges to evolution by natural selection that have arisen within biology itself. But he doesn't cover this strong theory that nevertheless may undercut its position. It's known as the neutral theory of molecular evolution, posited by Mutu Kamura. Am I saying that right? Mutu Kamura? Does that sound even approximately right? Very well. In the late 60s. And this theory claims that most molecular evolution is not caused by natural selection, but by genetic drift instead. That is, the random replacement of one gene by another, functionally equivalent gene. If this be true, many differences, I should say, between species have no authentic adaptive significance. The fact that your hemoglobin molecule looks like this, and the spider monkey's hemoglobin molecule looks like that, is merely a reflection of chance, not adaptation, in the neutral theory of molecular evolution. Dennett apparently does not want the reader to know that biologists have found a place where his universal acid becomes quite literally neutral, to put a pun on words, and that many biologists, myself included, believe that such non-Darwinian processes in evolution are common. But I suspect that the real explanation is that Dennett is interested in design with an uppercase D, not with design with a lowercase d. That being differentiatable by the notion of design coming from above versus divine or versus design arising from below. Indeed. Let me say this another way. I contend that Dennett wants to take down design, which is to say God, and thus the neutral theory that I just outlined doesn't fit within the schemata of intentions. If I am right about this, Dennett fundamentally misunderstands biologists' worries about adaptationism. Evolutionists are essentially unanimous that wherever there is apparent design in organisms, it is caused by natural selection. Indeed. Consider the illustrative phenomenon of mimicry in butterflies, wherein a tasty butterfly mimics the coloration of a unpalatable butterfly so as to avoid predation. We see the examples of this all throughout biology, in the biological realm. Anyone who denies that selection is at work here simply doesn't know enough about mimicry and biology. Even if we cannot at first fathom the precise cause of the remarkable similarity between the monarch butterfly and the viceroy butterfly, we know full well that unrelated species do not look alike by accident. There's a convergence oftentimes in butterflies as well. Not only do they mimic unpalatable species, but sometimes they also converge to look the same in their phenotypic display. Granted our difficulty, therefore, in discerning design and this penchant for concocting adaptive just-so stories where design is not really obvious, how could evolutionary biologists not have the jitters about adaptationism, I wonder? It would be an extraordinarily unreflective group that did not ask questions like, how seriously should we take these endless adaptive explanations of features whose alleged design may be illusory? Isn't there any difference between those cases where we recognize design beforehand versus where we impute design after the fact? Isn't there? Note that neither I nor Gould are truly invoking any mystical talk here of skyhooks at all. Rather, we're also not conducting anti-Darwin bashing. This is just sensible and modest concern about how much adaptationism is too much of a good thing. The evolutionary biologists often concoct just-so stories to explain evolutionary design. Gould and I contend that just-so stories are problematic in their losing game, evolutionarily and biologically speaking, I should say. Dennett never tackles legitimate worries about his just-so stories. It's easier for him to ridicule Gould, Lewontin, Kamura et al. Than it is to take on the heart of the gist of their argument. I suspect, my friends, that Dennett fails to appreciate these concerns, in part because his thinking is guided by a subtly misleading picture of adaptation. Dennett is fond of speaking of selection as leading organisms through design space, and that selection lifts organisms along ramps of good design. Although this imagery is often useful, it invites some misconceptions about adaptationism. The first is that natural selection cares about design at all. In reality, my friends, natural selection only sees brute death, birth, and reproduction. Not in that exact order, but nevertheless in some order. And biology knows nothing of design. Natural selection knows nothing of design. Selection is just as happy to lay waste to the kind of design that we associate with engineering as it is to build it. Consider the eyes of cave organisms that live in total darkness. If eyes are expensive to make, my friends, why not simply demolish them before they build them? If eyes are expensive to make, why do cave dwellers who live in total darkness have eye spots and eyes? It makes no sense. If eyes are expensive to make, selection can demolish their exquisite engineering just as sure as it built it. An optic nerve, my friends, with little or no eye, is most assuredly not the design one expects from an engineer's blueprint, but we find it in many species of crustaceans, for example. Whether or not this kind of evolution is common, it betrays the fundamental error in thinking of selection as trading in the currency of design. Evolution by natural selection does not trade in the currency of design with a capital D. Second, distorted imagery of selection lifting organisms along design makes it hard to see that selection sometimes moves individuals down trait ramps. For, as we all know, selection selects for overall fitness, not for particular results. It's not in the business of selecting for isolated traits. Adaptation is built from favorable mutations, but favorable mutations are just genetic changes that have net good effects. Such mutations need not have invariably good effects on every trait they affect. Indeed, this is extremely unlikely, for adaptive traits A and B might negatively influence trait C. It's known as pleiotropy. Notably, when I was making organisms in the laboratory that God didn't make, we would shoot DNA into the genome of cells, and we never knew where that DNA that we shot into the cells ended up at. And we'd often end up with various products from that genetic event that we caused to grow, and because of the location of the genes that we shot into them and shot into their genome, we'd end up with organisms that had all various manifestations of deformities and abnormalities. I mean, we had plants growing shoots off of instead of the spiral nature that you see most times on the spirotaxis that you see on plants. We had plants that were growing shoots out every opposite direction, not spirally. It's totally odd. Very, very messed up stuff. That was due to pleiotropy. We shot the genes into the genome, and we messed up with the tinkering of the genome that had been stabilized by millions, if not billions of years of evolution. And we were tinkering with it, and we reached the ramifications of that because of our messed up organisms. Nevertheless, such mutations need not have invariably good effects on every trait, as I said. In a world of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, we have no reason to expect optimal design with a capital D everywhere. This fact has nothing to do with non-Darwinian forces getting in the way of true Darwinian forces. As evolutionary biologists have long averred, it is simply adaptation in all of its messiness and its cumbersomeness. In the end, though, all of this gnashing of teeth over adaptations was not truly important to Dennett, I contend, in my reasoned opinion. All this gnashing of teeth over adaptation is not his key point. That's a side effect. Instead, it's the old trope of look what my right hand is doing now. Meanwhile, you don't notice that my left hand is getting your new AirPods out of your purse. That's what Dennett is doing here. He is causing us to look this way. Meanwhile, he's sneaking in behind closed doors. He's doing something else. Indeed, he is. So then, despite devoting a hefty portion of this book to this problem of adaptationism, Dennett is not ultimately concerned with how natural selection builds organisms. No. As we say down south, I should say, Dennett has bigger fish to fry. He wants to fry the biggest fish of them all. That is God. And all other ultimate explanations. Question: has he succeeded?
Yeah, so we can start our Q&A here then. We'll start with Bradford's question, and Dr. Patterson, you can moderate this the Q&A for this.
All right, so you have a question. Question is on the table. Has he succeeded in frying the biggest fish of all?
God. That's right.
I'll just throw out my thoughts. To me, God, and we're talking about this kind of discussion group, those spirituality is so intuitive that there's illiterate village people living right now that are never going to read Dennett's book. And he's never going to fry their notion of God, and they're always going to believe in God until the day they die. He's shooting. If that's his task, he's never going to accomplish it. It's too big of a fish.
One thing I brought up in our student circle is because even in Dennett's book, when he's talking about, I think at the very beginning of his discussion of adaptation, and he's talking about basically microbiology, and he's talking about amino acids and the need for basically the ways in which amino acids. What does he say? It takes hundreds of 100 or something molecular. Oh yeah. So in his discussion of molecular evolution, he's talking about how it takes
10 raised to the 130th power. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So many amino acids, and there's so many different possibilities, but then they come together in this one possibility. But then he kind of talks about molecular evolution and about the amino acids and how they come together, and then they develop they start off as RNA, but then they need something to kind of latch to in order to actually form into a formulation that can create life. And he talks about the clay that is able to do that, provide that ladder for them. And the whole time I'm like, well, he's discussing how it becomes possible within the physical world, that life can emerge just with the material that's in the planet, in the earth, But to me, what he doesn't answer is for me, it still always comes down to the question of necessity versus possibility. Because sure, it's these amino acids, and sure they're able to come together. And sure, there's this clay that acts as a ladder, but it's but why this and not that? Why these amino acids and not some other ones? Why this particular clay and not some other one? It brings up, to me, it still brings up the question of in the realm of possibility and necessity, there's a realm of possibility, and out of all the possibilities that could have happened, even though the possibilities might be inconceivable to us, it still happened to happen in this particular way. And why in this particular way? To me, that still is indicative of a necessary existence that is basically deciding this way and not that way.
Can I respond to that?
I would love you to.
It did not have to happen this particular way. We are a cosmic fluke. We are an item of history, an item of evolutionary history. We're not a preordained specimen. The way that the evolution of species occurred was that there were all singularities on the path toward complexity. of which we're not through yet advancing our complexity. What may come after us, we know not. But nevertheless, once that complexity took that veer, think of it like a 5-fingered hand with the rudiment of evolution at your wrist area. When evolution occurred, it went on various branches. Once the branches were taken, that locked in, you could say, the evolution of that line. Okay, well, some of those evolutionary lines didn't prove successful. Others did retroactively, and because they proved successful, that those adaptations as well as mutations on that particular branch of the tree of life got locked in, and then everything thereafter showed those same characteristics. So there are multiple. 98% of all species in the world are now extinct. Most of them because they were maladaptive. They were not suited to live in this environment. They were evolutionary dead ends. They came up against a brick wall and they stopped growing. They were one of these 5 fingers here that went different ways and didn't have a successful endpoint. Does that make sense at all? But once evolution went down your what do you call this finger here? Your forefinger, I guess, or index finger, yes, so to speak. Once the evolution went down your index finger path, everything thereafter shared those commonalities. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then from that index finger, another branching pattern occurred from which we have all the diversity of life today. So, but in order to understand why the index finger arose and survived, you've got to look at geological and paleontological data, which this text does not draw out, but nevertheless, these are singularities.
Does that really address your point, Logan?
I don't really feel like it does, because it's like, you're describing very well like how it happened, right? Like, yeah, it happened. There was all these, like 98% of all the species like didn't succeed. They all failed, and so we're basically a fluke. And all 98% are gone, and then there's still our one, singularity that branches out. But I think my point is like any number of other things could have happened, and because one thing happened, the whole thing you described happened rather than something else. That is indicative of a necessary being that is essentially determining what is going to happen out of all possibility, basically. Yeah.
So Logan, what you're saying is, as long as chance is involved,
Yeah.
doesn't that leave room for you to say, it wasn't chance, right?
Yeah, basically, yeah. There's a necessary being that is saying out of all the chances that could happen, out of all the things that could have happened, this thing is the thing that's going to happen. Yeah.
I think Daniel wants to join.
Daniel, yeah.
Just to respond to your point, I think, and this is going to be kind of hard for me to come back to, but it goes to Dennett's why not. If I had the idea that just because something was very, 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 very improbable, but still happened, I think Dennett's saying there's like no reason to believe that it's cool. It is something we would like to think there's meaning in our cosmic fluke, right? Because again, a lot of potentiality, and then we happen to happen. And then we, statistically, we weren't like a probable, but it happened anyways. And I think that's saying, so what? There's no real meaning in that. It's kind of like if I had a gigantic bag of quarters, right? And then on one quarter there was a blue dot. I drew a blue dot on one quarter, and in this bag there was like 1 billion quarters. Statistically, I can still pull out that quarter, but the fact is, it's just really improbable. And think of us as that blue dot on that one quarter in this universe full of quarters. Just because we exist in that bag doesn't mean we're any special. Because it just happens. Why not? Why not be that quarter with the blue dot? Just because statistically it's like really, really improbable, it's still possible. Therefore, there's no real miracle happening. And I'm taking this from something I learned from the Science Channel. Just because something is statistically rather impossible, the fact that it still has the ability of happening there's nothing miraculous about it. It's kind of like why we find so much wonder in a card trick. Because out of all those cards in the card, how did the magician pick out that one card without having known? A lot of it's just statistics.
So is that wonder that you feel even at the card trick? Is that wonder?
I think Dennett's saying that there really is no wonder in that. It's just a matter of math and algorithm.
And Logan is saying perhaps, Logan, that wonder is in the eye of the beholder?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, I think wonder is in the eye of the beholder. I guess you could say that. I mean, I guess, yeah, maybe it does just come down to a choice of like, I mean, if Dennett's saying why not,
but it's a specific type of why not.
Yeah.
Does anyone else like to get into the conversation?
I just have more of a question on expansion of a genetic drift and kind of why he rejects it. Because to me, on a surface level, genetic drift and natural selection kind of work hand in hand in some degrees. Unless I misunderstood.
He rejects natural drift or genetic drift because it is not a fundamental adaptationist occurrence. Rather, it is more chancy than what he likes. Dennett subscribes to the idea of chance-based mutations, but as an adaptationist, with an IST at the end, an adaptationist, he elevates adaptation to the highest level. So, in essence, he's making adaptation fill the role that we ordinarily ascribe to God. In so much as it being a superintending idea that controls the outcome, that being adaptation. So he does not like genetic drift because it's too unpredictable and it's too chancy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in connection of genetic drift and natural selection, that genetic drift could continue on through natural selection or it may not, depending on whatever factors. But I'm guessing. Yeah, but I get what you mean. It's a little bit too chancy.
Too chancy, right.
On top of adaptation. So.
Are you saying that it seems like anything that would be subject to chance would play into Dennett's case? So why not drift?
Not necessarily. Dennett is, may I say, I've never spoken to him, but he leans toward a deterministic viewpoint. But his view is biologically determinate and not theologically determinate. Does that make sense? So if you're going to find the biggest fish of all, then you have to have a completely unified theory. Mm-hmm. You have to explain everything without remainder. Right. And that's what I hear you saying about this. Yes, precisely. Adaptationism. And all these other things that Stephen Gould brings in extraneous are just to him messiness that he does not want in his system. And Gould is just going, oh, why not? Yeah, you've never seen Stephen Gould. He's very Yeah. Stephen Jay Gould. I have a penchant toward him. I'm presenting Dennett tonight, but I actually fall closer to Gould and Lewontin in this aspect. Yes, sir, Mr. Daniel.
I had a completely different point from what you're talking about, so it's fine.
Go ahead. Take us in another direction. We're coming up to the hour, so a new direction is fine.
New direction is fine?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Going back to your the question of did he succeed? Are we attributing to Dennett that he wanted to fry God in the first place?
Are we attributing that to him?
What's the issue with that?
I think he attributes that to himself.
Yeah, I mean, Dennett is pretty clear.
I think a good question. Did he want to attribute it to himself in the first place?
Dennett has Dennett is of the strain of biologists who have, like Dawkins and like even Gould to a degree, but not so overly so, who have an overarching methodology of doing science that is supervened or that is imposed on them by their worldview. They allow their worldview to therefore direct and interpret all of the data points of evolutionary studies. Now, and I contend that Dennett, although not formally one of the three new atheists, nonetheless fits more at home there than he does not. That being Dawkins, Hitchens, Sam Harris, and right, he fits in with those three guys. Although he's not as dogmatic or not as vociferous as the three horsemen of new atheism. But yes, he fits there better.
Just because he fits, I'm uncomfortable attributing to him that his goal from the beginning was to fry God, or else he wouldn't be calling it dangerous. In my opinion, he wouldn't be calling it dangerous in the first place.
What would he call it then?
The fact of, like, it's just something completely neutral. I mean,
I'm not sure.
I thought he was using it in the context of that it's dangerous to the notion of God.
God, exactly.
The whole point of why he's using it.
no, yeah, like, it's, does he want to put God in danger? I don't believe that was the case, but he's saying that this the moment he discovered Darwin, it put God in danger in his opinion.
I mean,
And I don't think he wanted to, but because it's there, it is in fact dangerous to God. That's all he's saying. He didn't want.
I mean,
Who is he? Are you saying that Darwin didn't? Darwin actually studied under. He enrolled in theology school. It was going to be not Episcopal, but a Church of England. Parishioner.
So Daniel's talking about Dennett, not Darwin. He thinks that Dennett is innocent of the things we're saying about him, that he really wants to fry the biggest fish of all. Daniel has doubts about that.
You're saying that we ascribe too much intent to Dennett, and he's only a blind process that wants to do.
Perhaps. Logan, it would make a lot of sense.
You have some help on this, Logan?
I think even on page 1 of the book, he starts the book with this song, right? Tell me.
Beautiful song. I listened to it so many times.
Yeah, tell me why the stars do shine, and then it ends with because God made the stars. That's why everything's so beautiful. And he basically starts the book saying like this song was beautiful as a kid, but now it's meaningless because of
Darwin's acid.
Because Darwin came in.
Yeah, because Darwin. So I mean, I think it's precisely making the point that you're saying is not the point. I think he's basically starting the book saying that like Darwin's idea is dangerous because it's correct and it's going to replace this idea that things are the way they are because God made them so. I mean, even in the next, I mean, in so many places he like throws in these, like he starts the chapter 7 with the quote from Genesis and then goes on to refute it there. And I think, he's constantly throwing
God language,
God language in there for the sake of disproving it. If he wasn't trying to fry the fish of God, I don't think he'd include any Bible verses in the first place, or any of these allusions to God. He wouldn't go through the trouble of putting them in there to disprove them, basically.
I had a closing comment that I think would indicate, I guess, the idea. The universal acid was to cut through everything, through all biologically extraneous, or that being extra stuff. Essentially, you break the word down and you get that stuff. But as Darwin's universal acid is propounded by Dennett, is it rendered and reduced merely basic through Gould et al.'s argumentation? I'm using their scientific terms to ask my question. Is Darwin's universal acid, that being something below the pH level of 6, or excuse me, 6.5 or 6 point whatever, 6.5, is that rendered basic above 7 in the pH scale? Is it rendered basic through Gould et al.'s argumentation? Has he essentially inoculated Darwin's universal acid?
I think we'd have to read some Gould.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I did read a little Gould. In 1991, he published in the New York Review of Books a review of several books on evolution, among them Dennett's. And he begins with a rather scathing comment that there's a lot of confusion about evolution brought to the conversation by people who have another agenda.
Bingo.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that Dennett was just steaming down Francis Avenue, a mile and a half away at Tufts University, as the famous scientist from Harvard skewered him in the New York Review of Books.
Right.
And you ask, why is he so adamant about taking on Gould? Well, that's, I'm sure, a big part of that.
Right, well, no doubt. I mean, but in that 11th chapter, he does present a skewed interpretation of Gould so as to knock him down, right? Yeah. Because whenever you can't win an argument, what do? You build up a straw man so you can cut the legs out from under him, right? You follow me? Right, so he does present Gould's basic argumentation in chapter 11. That's one of those guys that he's arguing against in chapter 11. But at the end of the day, is the universal acid of Darwinism safely on 2 feet, so to speak, or no?
I saw Jess raise his hand.
Jess, excuse me.
Yeah, I was commenting in general about what you were saying about kind of the bias. Like, I'm glad you brought up his bias of not wanting to address certain things, because I genuinely didn't know until I read earlier today in chapter 8. I didn't know what Dennett's science background was. I thought he was like a biologist or something, and I had wondered why there wasn't much like actual hard science in the book, and then why he was like so philosophically driven. But he's a science philosophy guy. He's like a philosophy of science, philosophy about it. His entire thing on the table is just that he's trying to push the philosophical implication of it. He totally would filter which information he's showing or which is accepting, which is rejecting.
So it's about 9 o'clock now. So Logan, is it all right with you if I put a bow on this thing?
That's fine. Yeah, no problem.
Do you have any closing wisdom for us, Dr. Patterson?
No, I just sense that most everyone around the table has reservations about Dennett. Right? But it's gonna. I think we should require of ourselves more than, hey, we just don't like this guy, or this just doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
I think we should require of ourselves that we try to put our finger on what the loose lug nut is here. What is the piece that's not quite working? And something that comes to me again and again as I'm reading Dennett is the question of meaning. And where does he presume that meaning comes from in a theistic system? What does he presume meaning comes from in religion? And do you have another idea, a different idea about where meaning comes from, where meaning derives in the phenomenon of religion? He's a little bit caught in the age-old debate that arose immediately when Darwin became known throughout the world. Namely, Darwin contradicts Genesis. And so if Darwin contradicts Genesis, then the Bible, Christianity, religion in general must be a lot of both. If the responsibility for the universe and all of its variety does not lie with a God out there somewhere, then the universe is meaningless. Now, my question to you all for this week, just to think about it, is there another way to imagine meaning in the universe?
Dennett's answer is yes, as we're going to find out in this week's reading. FYI. That is assuming that we do it. Right.
All right. Okay, so Logan, thanks for your work tonight. Bradford, thanks especially for your